Have you taken your German lessons?
Oh, yes, sir.
Good. You. How do you say thank you in German?
If you've never played Wolfenstein 2, it's kind of hard to explain because you need a lot of context. Because it's a game where you kill Nazis, but you can also listen to them talk. And despite the plot being about a white guy defending America, a bunch of gamers thought it was anti-America, or at least anti-white.
Come and fucking get me, you white-ass, fascist Nazi pigs.
And people were really mad about this. But the weirdest part was that the people who made the game saw all that internet anger and basically said,
So, fuck those guys, like,
It sounds like, okay, are we talking about Trump here?
all right, wait a second. So the guy on the left there, that's me. And you might be wondering how I got there and why I'm asking that question. So this is 7 years ago, and I was working for Vice News on HBO, and I was doing a segment on a game called Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus. So this is Pete Hines, who was then the senior vice president of marketing for Bethesda, which was the company that was publishing the game. This game was about to come out, and people were threatening to boycott it. You'd think he'd be concerned, but this is what he had to say about it.
fuck those guys, like,
So that's not his full answer, but I think we need more context to understand all this. So let's go back just a few months to June of 2017, when Pete Hines walked on stage at E3.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to the 2017 Bethesda E3 Showcase.
The presentation went on for about half an hour, but it was the trailer that they played at the end that got everyone's attention. It started off with these fake 60s TV shows that were all weirdly Nazi themed.
Okay.
And then they finally showed some gameplay.
I said a couple of months ago that the thing that Machine Games was working on is fucking bananas, so now you know what I mean by fucking bananas. So if you visit our booth this week at E3, you have a chance to go hands-on and begin the fight to rally the resistance in America against the Nazi regime.
Again, this was June of 2017. Then, in August, a group of white supremacists organized a rally called Unite the Right in Charlottesville. Before it happened, not that many people were taking it seriously. But then America woke up and saw that someone had been killed. And they saw the footage.
Will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
People had different reactions to this. Donald Trump, who'd only been president for a few months, infamously had this to say.
Some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group,
The fact that there were neo-Nazis openly marching around shocked a lot of people. And then, while the headlines were still fresh, just a few weeks after that rally, 2 days before the game's supposed to come out, Bethesda makes a tweet. And they've included a video. This was a pretty stark pivot. The old ads were high budget, well produced, and they had kind of a sense of humor. But these new ads were much more to the point, and you could even say they were confrontational. And they were drawing connections between the fictional Nazi timeline and specific references to real events and things that Donald Trump had actually said. A lot of people did not like these ads. Reviewers piled in, saying things like, the game might as well have been made by the terrorist outfit Antifa for all it says about white people. And the people who saw these new ads were wondering, is this about Donald Trump? So I asked the question.
Make America Nazi free again, or not my America. Basically, it sounds like, okay, are we talking about Trump here?
we're talking about Nazis.
You're kind of poking the hornet's nest here.
Maybe a little bit, but the hornet's nest is full of Nazis, so fuck those guys. Like, I'll poke a Nazi hornet's nest.
Look, in a lot of ways, not all that much has really changed in the last 7 years, because we're still having the same debates, the same arguments, and people still making a lot of the same comparisons.
He made a statement that I'm like Hitler. It's just couldn't be further from the truth. It's just the opposite, actually.
But look, if you didn't like Wolfenstein, that's fine. This video is not about making fun of you. And as a matter of fact, I think we should be taking some of those criticisms seriously. Because look, a lot of people feel like Wolfenstein is too harsh on white America.
Wolfenstein is a little weird about white people. I mean, it introduces the Black Panthers as a moral authority. It repeatedly suggests that America is and has always been an inherently racist country. And it paints some Nazis as pretty decent people.
But to understand that, we probably need to back up a little bit.
So Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus, is, like the number suggests, it's a sequel. And it's set in 1961 in this alternate reality in which the Nazis won World War II and have colonized America. If you've ever seen Man in the High Castle, just imagine that they sent the main dude to the gym for like 5 years, they gave him a laser, and they said, all right, bro, do your thing. But Wolfenstein itself has a history that goes back to 1981. The series actually got its start on the Apple II with Castle Wolfenstein. So the basic setup of the game is that you're a captured prisoner of war and you've been locked up in Castle Wolfenstein. Your mission is to find the Nazi war plans and escape the castle. But to do that, you need to sneak out of your cell and avoid detection by the guards. From today's perspective, it kind of looks like an elaborate Pac-Man, but instead of ghosts, it's Nazis. A lot of people consider this the first real stealth shooter game, and it makes sense because there's probably no Metal Gear without Wolfenstein. But the Wolfenstein franchise, as most people know it, didn't start up until over a decade later. 1992, Wolfenstein 3D drops on the PC. It's World War II, you're an American spy, you've been captured by Nazis and thrown into a dungeon. So far, pretty similar to the OG. But in this version, there's no more sneaking around. The stealth part that was a signature feature of the game is gone. In its place is, well, this. It was fun, it was bloody, and it was a smash hit. Game historians generally point to Wolfenstein 3D as the birth of the first-person shooter genre. That's not to take away from other games which had tried a 3D first-person perspective before, but id Software's take was different, for two big reasons. First, on a technical level, it was incredible. Texture mapping, digitized sound effects, enemy AI that responded to your movements in pseudo 3D space, all running at 60 frames per second. This game was unbelievable technologically. But id Software's true stroke of genius was in understanding how to make animated violence palatable. Pretty early on in video game history, violence was a touchy subject. The most infamous early example is Death Race from 1976. This is an arcade game where you drove a car around and crashed into enemies who would let out this digital scream when you ran them over. Parents were already creeped out enough that their kids were hanging out in these smoky, dark rooms with flashing lights, but now they were committing virtual vehicular manslaughter, complete with death groans. This was about 5 steps too far, and it's hard to overstate how completely wild this game was because, again, this was 1976. Gerald Ford was still in office. People had Pong machines at their house still. People were really, really mad about this game.
It's not a Volkswagen, it's not a Christmas tree, right? It's a human being. Is it harmful? To the extent that it again sanctions practice, training, learning how to hurt, kill other people, it sets the stage for when people are instigated to aggression to use those skills that they have.
The developers tried to explain that these were gremlins or monsters and you weren't running over humans, but the public didn't buy it, and before long, the game basically disappeared from arcades. Now, fast forward a couple decades, and we've got, for the time, an immersive 3D experience. It's not just cars, it's guns. And the graphics and the screams are much more realistic. And let's put this into context, because again, this was 1992. The very next year, there would be congressional hearings about violence in video games.
What you're about to see are scenes from two of the most violent new video games. First, we have Mortal Kombat. Blood splatters from the contestants' heads. When a player wins, the so-called death sequence begins. The game narrator instructs...
They even criticized Lethal Enforcers, which on paper seems like it would be an okay game because you're a cop that's fighting crime, but they really didn't like the guns.
Making a game and selling it that encourages a kid to point a gun at a television set. I mean, we're all aware of this incredible outbreak of gun violence in our country. Is it responsible? Let me put it another way.
But Wolfenstein, which had guns and blood, managed to avoid getting criticized in those hearings. They didn't even get a name drop. And it kind of makes sense, because what? Are you going to complain about killing Nazis? They're Nazis. They're basically not people. They're monsters, right? And that's where this new reboot becomes a problem. Because in this iteration of Wolfenstein, the Nazis are very much people. And if you play the game as the creators intended it, you run a pretty high risk of accidentally agreeing with the Nazi.
Wie können Sie Gewalt gegen uns gutheißen, nur weil wir anderer Ansicht sind?
Die sind halt gewalttätig, Karl.
Denen fehlt die moralische Richtschnur. Wir sind doch auch Menschen. Gewalt führt nur zu noch mehr Gewalt.
Das stimmt, Karl. Gewalt ist niemals in Ordnung. Niemals.
Was für eine Gesellschaft wäre das, wenn ich jeden töten würde, der meine Ansicht nicht teilt?
Ein Kriegsgebiet, Karl. Das wäre ein Kriegsgebiet.
Zum Kotzen. Übrigens, hast du dich für New Orleans beworben?
Na klar. Und du?
Auf jeden Fall.
Vielleicht sind wir in einer Todesschwadron.
Hoffentlich. Wir arbeiten doch gut zusammen, oder?
Ja.
Well, the political division in the country undeniably deep right now.
Navigating a divisive political climate on a range...
Republicans attack Democrats, and Democrats return fire. Social media is a showcase of our anger. An analysis by the New York Times this fall found that online use of the phrase civil war has exploded.
If you were to remove that from its context, that conversation sounds completely reasonable. Violence is wrong, and political disagreements should be handled in a civil manner. And in 2017, this was a very serious conversation because people were arguing over whether or not it's okay to punch a Nazi because, well, somebody punched a Nazi.
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Which, of course, Wolfenstein couldn't resist making a parody of for another advertisement. Maybe you're seeing a pattern here, but this conversation takes place between two Nazi stormtroopers. So you're crawling up a staircase, your fingers on the R2 trigger, and you're thinking, I think my mom might have posted something like this on Facebook last week. Do those Nazis have a point? Am I supposed to shoot these guys? In fact, aside from a handful of almost cartoonishly sadistic characters, a lot of the Nazis in this reboot seem pretty reasonable, and some of them are deliberately depicted as sympathetic characters. So there's this part where you're hunting down some Nazis who've been hiding from you for months. They're not trying to attack you. They don't want to attack you. They're trapped in the lower part of your submarine, and they just want to escape. And you overhear one of them trembling in fear at the thought of having to confront the terrorist. By the way, that's you. They call you a terrorist. And you also hear his older brother consoling him and saying he'll protect him.
Sobald das U-Boot auftaucht, sind wir in Sicherheit. Brüderchen. Und jetzt sei tapfer und mach dir keine Sorgen.
In order to progress in the game, you have to kill both of them.
Johann! Das war mein Bruder, du Drecksau! Mein Gott, der ist es!
You also read postcards from sons writing to their mothers back home. The Nazis in this game are people. These are people who have friends, families, emotions, fears, hopes, dreams, just like you. At one point, you even have to confront the family of someone you killed. This all probably seems like a really bad idea because, once again, we're talking about Nazis here. This is a group that we consider to be universally evil. And so wouldn't humanizing them be immoral at best and dangerous at worst? I mean, these are monsters, right?
Das war dein Bruder, du Sauhund! Ja, Bruder!
That would be a fair criticism, but it wouldn't be the first time it's happened. We could go back to 1963 to the political theorist Hannah Arendt when she was dealing with precisely this same problem. She had just published a study of Adolf Eichmann, who was a Nazi leader who, among other things, organized the sending of Jews to the extermination camps. Arendt went to some of the trial, and she described it in articles she wrote for The New Yorker, where she concluded that Eichmann was not a monster, but instead a, quote, terrifyingly normal person. This is not really what people expected from someone who was herself a Jew and had to flee Germany as the Nazis rose to power. And a lot of people attacked her for humanizing a man who committed unimaginable crimes against humanity and for trivializing the horrors of genocide. But Hannah Arendt countered that her point was never to trivialize anything. She'd wanted to argue that, quote, under conditions of terror, most people would comply, that some people would fight, but most wouldn't, and that a fascist government would dehumanize people and turn them into, as she said, functionaries and mere cogs in the administrative machinery. She had a phrase for this: the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt's work is still controversial to this day, which we're not going to get into. But I think that the concept of the banality of evil is helpful to put into context for what I think Tommy Bjork, who was the narrative designer for the Wolfenstein series, was aiming for. So I don't have the footage for this conversation. I think we might have cut it out of our video interview, but this is how I quoted him in an article that I wrote for Vice back then. He said that, I think all societies are susceptible to those kinds of ideologies, those kinds of fascist ideologies, if they don't fight them. He also said, I think that's something you get to see in the game. There's a whole spectrum of reactions within American citizens toward this takeover. Some of them welcome it. To be really abundantly clear here, Tommy Bjork's point was not to suggest that the Nazis had a point, because he and I both agree that they did not have a point.
Streets. It sounds kind of personal for you.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I fucking hate Nazis. Can you say that?
You can say that.
So,
I think what he's getting at here in this interview is maybe better summarized in some of his work in this scene.
Monsters did this.
Not monsters. Men.
Let's talk about America a little bit. One of the most striking pre-release advertisements for this game is this scene right here.
He's a big fan of DK for Ain't Jeff.
The music makes me happy. What's wrong with that, Wayne?
Nothing wrong with that, Jeff. I like your style, Americans. Very good.
It shows a Nazi soldier having what looks like a pretty friendly conversation with two hooded Klansmen. And it kind of makes sense, right? There's two evil groups getting along together. Someone even posted it on YouTube, and it's got some pretty funny comments. But if you actually play the game, the part after this is not funny. There's a lot of really unsettling stuff that they don't show you in the ad. And to see that, you have to actually explore the town. So this is where we get to see what a normal or banal day looks like in America. If you hang out long enough, you'll eventually hear someone complaining about their slaves acting up because apparently the Nazis let them have their slaves back. And then there's this woman who thanks the Nazis for ridding the country of certain elements of American culture.
I just couldn't stand all that primitive jungle music they used to play. Jazz and rock and roll. Quite verschrecklich, like you would say, right?
Yes. Good, Fräulein Adler.
The most vile and disgusting characters in this scene are not German. They're Americans. In effect, there's times when even the Nazis seem a little bit confused about the mechanics of white American racism. Earlier on in the game, the daughter of a Nazi general runs away and joins your team. And when you first bring her onto your ship, she notices that there's a black man in the control room. And she freaks out because she doesn't understand.
Radio contact with an American resistance group in New York City. Now, we need to
Do you allow blacks on board? Oh my God. How did that man get in here? No.
Everyone is allowed on this boat. Except Nazis.
Now, I want to spend some time here because why she says that, why she reacts this way, the story leaves it kind of ambiguous. And I think there's a couple possibilities here. Maybe the most obvious one, or the first obvious one, would be, okay, well, she's a Nazi, so she's racist, and so she would hate black people, right? That makes sense. But it doesn't really seem to work out because later, that same black dude, she has sex with him.
I'm sorry. Did you need this boat?
Yes, motherfucker.
So there might be another explanation here. Maybe she's just confused because she speaks English and she's studied America. She understands American culture and American racism. And you've got a bunch of Americans on board. So why aren't you all racist like most Americans? All right, let's back up a little bit. So the same year that Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, was released, another piece of Nazi history-related media also came out. But this wasn't a fictional alternate history. This is actual, real history. And this book, Hitler's American Model by James Whitman, explains that a lot of Nazi policy came from the United States. The author explains that in the early 1930s, the Nazis were not planning on extermination. They thought the solution to their Jewish problem was either forcing them out of the country or at least taking away their rights and isolating them. But they had no idea how to write policy to achieve this goal. They needed a blueprint. And they found their biggest inspiration in America. Nazi legal scholars were extremely impressed by American racism. They thought it was amazing that even though we had things like the 14th and 15th Amendments making sure that former slaves were A, citizens, and B, had the right to vote, that we'd still figured out these clever workarounds to make it actually almost impossible for black people to enjoy those rights in practice. We had somehow managed to create a new second class of citizens. And what we'd done with immigrants was even more impressive. Hitler himself admired how America, quote, simply excludes the immigration of certain races, and he was equally impressed at our genocide of Native Americans to make room, or Lebensraum, for white settlers. And as the author says, indeed in Mein Kampf, Hitler praised America as nothing less than the one state that had made progress toward the creation of a healthy racist order. The Nazis considered America to be the most forward-thinking country on the planet in terms of racist policy. For the Nazis, American creativity wasn't just about writing pop music or Hollywood movie scripts. It was in writing imaginative laws to deny certain races access to actual American citizenship. And the most impressive thing to them was that our discrimination was all done by the book. Everything was legal because we made it legal. So the Nazis tried to catch up to America and started adapting our laws. But they didn't just copy-paste our policies into the Nazi law books because, as the author says, the Nazis treated American race law as too harsh to be borrowed wholesale by Nazi Germany. Let me say that again. The Nazis thought our laws, especially things like our Jim Crow laws, they thought they were too harsh and that they needed to be toned down to work in Nazi Germany. As the author explains, in the 1930s, the Nazis thought of their program as a, quote, more thoroughgoing and rigorous realization of American approaches toward minorities, even if the regime had shifted its sights to a new target in the form of the Jews. And it wasn't just Nazis taking notes from Americans, because Americans were also taking notes from the Nazis. Just months before World War II broke out, 20,000 Nazi sympathizers gathered at Madison Square Garden for a rally. And this wasn't the only group. In another book, Hitler's American Friends, the Third Reich supporters in the United States, Bradley W. Hart explains that there were a bunch of groups that were big Hitler fans. These range from political groups to Christian preachers. A lot of people thought that Nazi-style fascism should be brought to America. The America First Committee was even trying to get a fascist-friendly candidate to be elected president. The guy they thought would be best for the job was Charles Lindbergh, who was the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Lindbergh never actually said he wanted to run, but he was pretty racist and he was a celebrity, so the smart racists thought he might be useful. Fortunately, most of these groups were very badly organized, and they usually fell apart because of mismanagement or infighting. All of this is to say that not only did the Nazis find us very interesting and sometimes useful, there were a lot of Americans who were also pretty fond of what the Nazis were doing too. And if a few things had gone differently, the world of Wolfenstein could have been real, aside from the lasers and space colonies and stuff.
Gabs, don't you just love parades? They make you feel so safe.
Look, I'm not trying to hate on every American ever, because obviously there were Americans who were not convinced by this fascist rhetoric, and we see those people in the game. But it's interesting. So early on in the story, your character meets a woman named Grace Walker.
Just who the fuck are you, white boy?
Stay calm. Let me first make it absolutely clear that I am not a Nazi.
Now you bring Super Spesh back in and you put him down right now, or I will shove this grenade so far up your ass, I'll be dancing and rejoicing as your entrails trickle down from the ceiling. You dig, man?
She's the leader of a resistance group called the Black Liberation Front, which seems to be a pretty clear reference to the Black Liberation Army, which was an actual real organization partially comprised of former Black Panthers. They even have buttons that say Free Huey, which is the campaign to free Huey Newton, who is another Black Panther, and again, this is a connection to real life. Once Grace Walker enters the picture, she immediately takes charge of operations. From this point on, she's the boss. But if you've played the previous game in this reboot series, you'll probably realize that her function as a character is, well, not much of a character. She's really there more to serve as a vehicle for a particular message. Specifically, she's kind of like an expanded version of this other character in the previous game named Jay, who is an obvious Jimi Hendrix reference, who's mostly there to explain Black people's take on Nazis.
The gas chamber just like they did all the others.
None of that has anything to do with me. That's not the America I fought for.
Really? I was little, my mother wanted to take me to the picture show, but we had to go in through the fucking colored entrance. I wanted a hot dog and a lemonade, but the sign says we don't serve Negroes in this establishment. You're a patriot. Blue-eyed, jarhead, motherfucking Nazi-killing patriot that you are, you're still a fucking puppet to the man. You're exactly the kind of guy they ordered in come lynching time. You don't get it, do you? Before all this, before the Germans, before the war, back home, man, you were the Nazis.
Be careful what you call me.
Violence. Language of the man. Can't you see? We're all just brothers and sisters now, aren't we?
Grace and Jay are examples of a kind of trope that functions within this game. That the people with the best grasp on reality and the people who truly understand America in the Wolfenstein universe are Black. White people, there are exceptions, but white people are generally either clueless or they're complicit with the Nazis. And finally, here is maybe where we can address some of those complaints from people who gave this game bad reviews. This game is not saying that all white people are bad, obviously, because the main character, the guy you control, Billy Blazkowicz, is white, and he's a good guy. What it is saying is that for white people, it's possible to be unaware of what's going on, and that is not a luxury that most Black people would have. I mean, let's go back to how we first meet Grace. One of her first functions is to point out the inherent racism that America had even before the Nazis arrived, and tells your character that not all white Americans even want to be free of the Nazis.
Right, Grace. Put the fighting spirit back in the American people. Ignite a revolution.
Shit. We've been fighting every motherfucking day, Blazkowicz. White America, though? They done packed up and given in. See, I guess they don't have the fighting spirit no more. Nah, they just do whatever the fucking Fuhrer tells them to do.
That's baloney. They want to fight the Nazis just as much as we do. All they need is for someone to show them how.
You know who's running the South after the Nazis took over? The Ku Klux motherfucking Klan, am I right?
That's it.
So what you gonna do? You gonna go down there and hold hands with them and build bridges and persuade them to join our cause? Get your head out your ass, Blazkowicz.
And now I think we're starting to get a little closer to what some of those angry commenters, those angry reviewers were mad about, because some of them probably felt a little bit attacked. But hold on. I don't think it's fair to say that everyone who was angry about this game was a literal Nazi sympathizers. I think a lot of people who are angry at the game, at least the way they say it, is that they're not angry about the politics of the game. They're angry that the game has politics at all. That political themes don't belong in a game. Games are fun, and this is just a game. Okay. I think what's behind that kind of thought is the recognition that a game can be more personal than other mediums. Because look, in a book or a film, there's a sense of distance between the thing that you're experiencing and you. But games are different because you're actually controlling the character. Things don't happen to somebody on the screen, they happen to you. So when someone tells your character that America is racist, they're not talking to that character, they're talking to you. And if you're American, and especially if you're also white, that might make it feel a little bit more personal than you're prepared for. But let's pause for a second, because maybe this game isn't so scary if you're white. I think there's a couple ways of looking at this game. Because on the one hand, there's kind of a white savior thing happening here. So again, you're playing as BJ Blazkowicz, and you find out in the beginning of the game that his mother's Jewish. But that's not really brought up much after that. When people call him white, BJ doesn't correct him, and even the Nazis refer to him as white.
Fireman, I recognize your face. Very Aryan face at this too. Are you out of Station 1?
His father's white, and his father is an absolute villain to the point of being basically a caricature. In the first scene of the game, we see his father strangle a child, hit his wife, hit a dog, spout anti-Jewish tropes, say the N-word twice in the space of like 45 seconds. Right after that, he says something homophobic, and there aren't even any gay people in this scene. And then he makes you kill your own puppy. He's so hateful, it's almost not believable.
Shoot her.
And so, spoiler alert, but this shouldn't really be a spoiler, when we see BJ's father become a Nazi sympathizer later on in the game, we can say, okay, yeah, figures. He was a bad guy back then, and of course he would side with the bad guys. I would never do that. And this is why I think we could call BJ a white savior, because this pattern follows that trope perfectly. So the white savior trope works because film directors know that we can't pretend racism doesn't exist because we know it exists. We've read about it at school. But if you show racism on screen, you risk white people getting their feelings hurt, and they might not want to watch your movies anymore. That's bad. So there's a strategy. You give the viewer two white people. You give them one really bad racist one, and that's the foil, and the other person, you give them a good, not racist white person. And you kind of hint to the viewer that, okay, obviously you wouldn't be that one. You'd be this nice second guy.
In our courts, all men are created equal.
And you could argue that that's what BJ is for. See, controlling BJ doesn't just feel good because you have big guns and heavy armor and big muscles. When you play as BJ, you get to feel not only physically superior, but morally superior. Reading history, and especially looking at pictures from history, is really uncomfortable when you see someone who looks like you in those pictures. We all like to think that if we lived back in some historical period, that we would have been on the right side of history. Maybe we wouldn't be this guy, but we could definitely be this guy, right? But that's not probable. You might not have been this person or this person, but statistically speaking, most of the people watching this, you would have been this guy. or her, or him. If the world of Wolfenstein 2 were real, you, watching this video, if you were given the opportunity, you probably would have joined the Nazi Party. I'm not making a value judgment on you. I'm sure you're a great person. I'm just speaking statistically. Most people will simply comply.
That's nice, dear. Give my regards to your father when you return to the farm. Oh, and tell him I'm putting some hardworking slaves up for auction this week if he's interested. There'll be cocktails.
I'll tell him, Auntie. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye, dear.
This is what Hannah Arendt was talking about. Playing as BJ allows you to escape that reality a little bit. But then, on the other hand, BJ is a little bit more complicated than that, if you know where to look. BJ is not exactly a perfect white savior. He might be the guy who's most physically ready for the job, but he's not a leader. He's a soldier. He has a good moral compass, but we see him over and over again having to have somebody else, usually somebody black, have to explain to him that, look, man, America's actually a pretty terrible place, and it has been for a really long time. BJ doesn't like hearing this, but it keeps being proven to him.
Wish you'd come with me. Kind of on the spot, you know. Pretty well cornered by the man, actually.
Somebody will lay it out for him. They'll explain reality. They'll explain the reality of American racism to him. And in the moment, he'll nod and it seems like he gets it. And then in the very next scene, he's getting offended that somebody else is explaining to him that they see America differently for him. He's kind of ignorant for the entire game. And it makes you wonder why BJ is even on our side. And honestly, if BJ didn't have very serious daddy issues, he might not be. BJ joined the army not to save the world or out of any real sense of justice, but as far as we can see, he joined to escape his abusive father.
Ain't nothing you can offer to make up for what you done to us. I think of my father, I see a fuck you and a fist flying in my face.
When'd you ever do right by me?
If his dad hadn't been such a cartoon villain jerk, BJ might have just ended up as some middle manager working a desk job for the Third Reich. So which is the correct way to look at Wolfenstein? Is BJ a white savior character that lets white people off the hook too much? Or is he a parody of the white savior stereotype? Maybe a little bit of column A, maybe a little bit of column B, or maybe it's something else. A little earlier, we talked about those two books that explain the actual history of American and Nazi interaction and influence. But again, this is a game, which does something that neither of those books do, and does something that maybe no book can ever do. When those books describe Nazi policies, they use words like sinister, or evil, or unimaginably horrifying to make sure that we know that the authors think that the Nazis are bad. And look, I understand why they do this. And don't get me wrong, Wolfenstein the game kind of does it too. It makes it very clear that Hitler is not somebody to look up to. When we finally see Hitler, his mind is completely gone. And he spends most of his on-screen time vomiting, crying for his mother, or in the fetal position. But with the rank and file Nazis, Wolfenstein is a little bit more hands-off. It lets you experience, even in a small way, what the normalization of Nazism might look like. So let's go back to that small town. Talk to everybody. What do we do with the fact that in this entire town, there are a grand total of 2 people that we could call good guys? The first one is a newspaper seller who whispers to you that he supports your movement. But he's too much of a coward to actually say that out loud.
One Reichsmark. Say, mister, you look familiar to me. Are you some kind of celebrity? Mister, you... Oh, God. If you are who I think you are,
I just want you to know I am behind you all the way.
And then he goes back to selling Nazi newspapers. The only guy who's willing to tell the truth to a powerful figure is this homeless drunk guy lying down by a dumpster. He thinks you're a Nazi and he starts yelling at you.
Know a secret? Well, I won't tell you, because you're a fucking Nazi traitor. Uh-huh. But you I can trust.
And then he goes back to talking to his bottle. Which one of these would you be? Which one do you want to be? The cowardly guy who's still selling propaganda? The lady who's sucking up to the Nazi officer? The one guy who spoke the truth and became an outcast for doing it? Most people will comply. And look, I take back what I said earlier. Maybe you wouldn't join the Nazi party. Maybe you'd be one of the few that would fight. Maybe you'd be BJ. Maybe you'd be super special. But maybe you'd be this guy and end up here. When we look at those awful, evil people in our textbooks and think, I would have done the right thing, we sometimes forget that those people probably had their own textbooks and thought the same thing about themselves. The times and the locations are different, but when you play through this game, you might start thinking that the questions have always been the same. If your family member joined a group that you didn't agree with, or voted for a group you didn't like, would you keep quiet about it so that it didn't cause arguments at the dinner table? If you knew your country was fighting a war to oppress people somewhere else in the world, would you speak up? What if it affected your friendships? What if it affected your job? If it was more convenient to pretend not to see things, would you eventually start to not see them? And if you decided, finally, that enough was enough, what would you do about it? Argue? Vote? Fight? Who's the terrorist? Of course, none of this stuff is mandatory to beat the game. You don't have to deal with almost any of this if you don't want to. You don't have to pick up any of those extra readable newspapers. And if you think some of those Nazi conversations might feel a little bit too close to home and upset you, you can shut them up by just shooting the offending characters before they start talking. I mean, if you're feeling triggered, pull the trigger. Problem solved. I don't think this game was meant to change anybody's mind about anything, and I don't think it has to. If you're far right, or if you're an actual Nazi, you probably just ignore the story. And the further left you are, you're more likely you are to find some of the black characters a little bit flat and maybe even exploitative. I'm not saying Wolfenstein has all the answers or even any answers, but if you're willing to meet the game where it is, or maybe better said, if you're willing to let the game meet you where you are and treat it as another way to think about something that most people avoid thinking about, you'll probably find yourself asking yourself some questions. But hey, who knows? It's just a game.
Wir arbeiten doch gut zusammen, oder? Ja.
Was war das für ein Geräusch? Ein Toter! Durchsucht den Bereich!